In this tutorial, we are going to learn the basics of Pro Tools' sampler virtual instrument called Structure. I've got some tracks set up here. I have an instrument track and two MIDI tracks that we'll use to control the patches in Structure. So let's open up the plugin window. And I'd like to give a quick overview first before we add our own patches. So here on the left side we have the patches. You can have many different sounds here. They can all be routed to different MIDI channels and audio outputs. So you can have many MIDI tracks controlling each patch separately, all within one plugin, saving valuable computer resources. So right here is a sine wave sound. If I hit the keyboard, we'll hear it. I'm going to add another patch by clicking the patch menu here, add patch, and I'll choose multi-sample. How about this one here? You notice it's loading some drum sounds here. We can see that. Now if I hit keys on the keyboard, we'll hear different drum sounds. And there they are. Alright, I can click back to the sine wave and hear that. Okay. One of the great things about a digital sampler or a virtual instrument sampler is you can load your own audio files in and have them triggered by the keyboard. So let's look at the keyboard mapping for these. I can do that by clicking the Edit button. And you can see here on the left side it shows which sounds are loaded into this patch. In this case there's a sine wave sound. And down here you see a keyboard along the bottom. Above that is a big box, and you'll see it says sine wave right here. This is showing that this sound is mapped across the entire keyboard. Okay. One other thing that's important to note, this area between this empty space and the waveform up here, it says root note. That's the original sounding note, so you want to map that to the right key. And this is the key range. It says C-2 to G8. That means that this one sample is being mapped across the entire keyboard, basically being sped up or slowed down. Faster, slower. Okay, I'm going to exit this window, go back to our main window, and let's look at how the drum kit, which is many different sounds mapped across different keys. Right? There's toms, there's a snare drum, hi-hat. Let's see how that mapping looks different. So I'm going to click Edit. And this is very different. Notice how many different sounds are included in this one patch. All these are audio files on the left-hand side. I can click on one and you'll see in the waveform window that they change. I can actually preview each one of these. If I click on one and hit the play button, we're hearing that. Hear this one. Okay, so we're hearing that actual sample. And notice now that the entire area here is not filled, but just individual columns. And each of these columns is over just one note. For instance, this note has tom-toms, and if I play on this note here, we're hearing bass drums, and there's many parts to the column. These are each individual samples. So this is a velocity mapped or multi-sampled bass drum. In other words, you play the key harder, you're hearing a different bass drum sample. As I click it, notice the names changing on the left and the waveform changing on the top. Here's one sample. That's the soft bass drum. This must be the louder one. Okay. So that way, as you play the key harder, you're getting a realistic change in tone, an actual different audio file for louder samples. So this is a cool way of mapping. You can have individual sounds on each key as well. Let's notice the middle area as I highlight one of these. This is the root key, C1. That's the tone that is the original sounding pitch for that note. And it's mapped from key C1 to C1, which means it's mapped to only one key on the keyboard. Okay. I can actually expand that if I click on this sound here. See what it sounds like. Okay, that's open hi-hat. If I change this to a higher value, watch what happens to the box below. It's expanding up. And now I actually have many versions of this sample. If I hit higher keys, I would trigger higher samples. depending on the velocity it's sending. Okay, we'll work with this more when we drop in our own samples. So I'll exit here. Let's note a few things before I delete these patches. There's a MIDI channel choice of many. You can choose many MIDI channels, and there's different audio output choices. So I can have the MIDI from one MIDI track go to this patch, and I could have the MIDI from another MIDI track go to this patch separately, and their audio outputs could go out of different auxiliary tracks or instrument tracks. So you can have a whole orchestra set up in just one plugin, or a whole rock band or whatever. Okay, let's delete these. Start from scratch. So I'll start by adding an empty patch, and I'll name this one voice. I have a sample of a single note on a voice. Add a second patch. Call this drums. Here's when we're going to have different drum notes on different notes. And as we can see, it already says MIDI channel A1, A2. So let's look at our MIDI track outputs. Here's my two MIDI tracks. So right now, the MIDI signal is not being sent anywhere from this track. So I want to choose A1 for my voice MIDI track structure, A1, and A2 for my drum track. Now when I hit my MIDI keyboard, I should be triggering those different patches. At this point, there's no patches in, so we're not going to hear anything. They're just empty. That was my office piano we heard. Okay, so let's load up these patches. In fact, I'll use my remote keyboard so we can see the keyboard on the screen. And I'm actually going to choose my MIDI keyboard. My little virtual keyboard here is the input. All right. So let's add some samples. So move this so I can see my clips. Let's start with the voice. Choose Edit. And I'm going to bring it out of the way for a second. And I'm going to drag this note here. Sounds like this. And it's on the note C sharp. That's the pitch of this note. So I'll know how to map it to the keyboard. So I'm going to take this and just drag it into this window. And it asks if it wants to import this sample. I'll say OK. And now we see it in the structure window. And if I click on one of the keys, we should hear it play back. It's mapped to this note. There it is. I could also play it by doing the preview. Okay, and since I said this note was a C sharp, I want to put it on the key that is C sharp. So I'm actually going to scroll down and say C sharp 2 as my root note. Now we don't hear anything because we don't have this mapped to that note. So let's move it over. Okay. Notice the pitch has changed, however. As I dragged it, it mapped the root of it to a lower note, so it thinks when I play this key that it should sound higher. I know that seems strange. So let's type the correct numbers in here. The root is going to be C sharp 2, and I'm going to give it a key range across the keyboard. So notice how it's spreading out. I can click this way, or I can actually drag the file out. Now the C sharp 2 is playing the original pitch, and other keys are playing higher or lower pitches. Okay. Something else cool I can do, since the waveform is here, I can actually do some micro editing of it. I can change its start point. Maybe that's a little better. I can even do a little fade in so there's no pop. Okay, and then do it with my MIDI keyboard, not yet. Okay, so I've mapped this tone across the entire keyboard. All right, let's get to our drum sounds next. So I'm going to go to edit my drums. And I need to drop in my drum samples. So I have a hi-hat, bass drum, and snare drum. Okay, and I can preview those. There's my bass drum, there's my snare, like that. Okay. So now we simply have to put those over the keys that we want. Maybe I want the snare over E1. Let's see. There's my snare. And not only did I put it on the key E1, but I said that E1 was its root note, meaning when you play E1, it'll play it in tune. If I drag this out, now I can play higher and lower versions, but I just want to have the original sound. So I'll just say from key E1 to E1. Okay, now let's get our bass drum in there. There's our bass drum note. And I want that to be on C1, from C1 to C1. There's our bass drum. And now I'll click on my hi-hat so that shows up. And I want my hi-hat to be on F sharp 1 right here. Okay, that's standard general MIDI mapping. Okay, so now I've got them all set up on their different keys. And there we hear all three of them. Okay, so now if we record data in our MIDI tracks, this should be set up hopefully to go to this track. Let me check my MIDI through. There it is. You can see it plays that track, and if I do my drums, there's my bass drum and my hi-hat. So now all I need to do is record some MIDI on these tracks, and I'm good to go. Last but very important step is how you save your new patches. If we go to the preset menu, we choose Save Settings As, and it will show you a structure folder and ask you to save your settings. But beware, this structure folder is the one that's part of the DigiDesign folder that contains the Pro Tools application. It is not the file that you have on the student disk. It is not your exercise file. So we need to navigate to that. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to find my session folder, plugin settings. This is the structure folder that you want, the one that's inside your session folder. All right, you give it a name, press save. Now when you go to the menu below presets, it will show your patch file loaded up, and it's ready to go.